Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest today is Jerry Freeman. Jerry is an old friend of mine from TM movement days. I'll read his little bio here. He's been practicing transcendental meditation and the advanced techniques of TM, called the TM Cities program, beginning shortly before turning 19, over 40 years ago. He was trained by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi as a teacher of TM the following year, lived for some years in semi-monastic program Maharishi founded, which is where I knew him from, and has continued to study Maharishi's teachings to this day. He writes about Maharishi's insights into the development of higher states of consciousness as they relate to today's discussion of Advaita, Vedanta, awakening, self-realization, and enlightenment. He is presently working on a book on this subject, tentatively titled The Enlightenment Puzzle, What Everyone Should Know About Awakening. In the book's introduction, he states, "What I have to say here is not my own invention. What I will say here is not an official presentation of Maharishi's teaching, as it includes numerous observations and conclusions that are my own. However, the great insights about awakening, human consciousness, enlightenment, etc. are not mine. They are Maharishi's." Jerry supports a family of adopted children, working as a musical instrument maker. He makes penny whistles. His penny whistles are recommended by many Irish music instructors for their students, as they're affordable and very high quality, and they're played in performance and recordings by many of the most renowned performers of Irish music. So, that's an intro to Jerry. Welcome, Jerry.
Hi, Rick. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, and such a beautiful backdrop.
Yeah, you can just almost see Mount Arunachala over there, off to the side there.
Yeah. Jerry's in Coventry, Connecticut, and I grew up in Connecticut myself, southern Connecticut.
Yeah. In fact, you instructed the mother of my significant other.
Right. Yeah.
In TM. She lived to be 93, and she meditated twice a day, every day of her life since the day you taught her TM.
Cool.
Yeah.
Chip off the old block, because I've done the same since I've
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to start, as we often do in these interviews, by just sketching out your personal story, particularly with regard to spirituality and development of consciousness and all. And I believe you'd like to actually start back in your childhood days.
Yeah, not anything really unusual to say about that. Probably quite typical of the people that you interview. I can't report any special experiences when I was a child. I grew up in a conventionally religious Christian household, and starting from, I would say, pretty young, I just kind of looked at that, and I never got a sort of an emotional connection. I never felt like I knew Jesus or got religion or any of the things that people around me seemed to be experiencing and felt really strongly about. And I was kind of just wondering, well, what is this? And it doesn't quite make sense to me. I see these people are experiencing something. I tended to be rather skeptical, even cynical, probably from about the age of 3. And so I was really looking behind the scenes to try to figure out, well, this doesn't quite work for me. There must be something deeper. Or at least, not to be judgmental about it, something that's more suitable to me than what I was surrounded by. So around the age of 15, at that point I was really quite disillusioned, and things were going on. There was the Vietnam War and a lot of generational conflict and so forth. As an assignment for our high school class, we read W. Somerset Maugham's book, The Razor's Edge, which, if some of your viewers are perhaps younger and aren't familiar with that, it's a story of a young man who had fought in World War I and had a spiritual crisis as a result of that, essentially renounced worldly things and went looking for the greater truth, and went to India and essentially became enlightened. And Maugham did a beautiful job of really mapping those issues and how the Eastern approach towards enlightenment addressed them, at least in a way that could be absorbed by popular culture at the time. Reading that book really crystallized for me. I just knew, having read that book, yes, that is it. That's what I want. That's where I'm going. That's what my life is about. But I had no idea really what to do next. And I'll make a comment here also. It's more than an interesting sidelight. There's a guru in the book, The Razor's Edge, that the young man meets and has his breakthrough of connecting with something deeper. The inspiration for that character, and really the inspiration for the entire book, was a visit by W. Somerset Maugham to Ramana Maharshi in 1928.
Yeah.
And he was so struck by the depth and power of Ramana Maharshi's silence and wisdom that he wrote that book, and it's considered to be one of his two great masterpieces. Now, that is something that I only found out really not terribly long ago, just in the last several years, but I was struck by the fact that it really reflects the greatness of Ramana Maharshi, that he could have that influence on someone who saw him only for a couple of days, such that Mom put into writing his impressions from that, and that changed the direction of my entire life. Mm-hmm. So that many steps away from Ramana Maharshi, he's able to have that effect on the direction of a life.
Mm-hmm. He definitely sent out some ripples.
Yeah. So there's that. But I didn't know what to do. I knew that crystallized. I knew where I needed to go, but I didn't know, how
to get there.
Yeah, I couldn't find a path to walk on. And then, of course, one of the major events of our generation, the Beatles, came to Transcendental Meditation in Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And at that point, there was just no resistance at all. That was just clearly it. That's it. That's what I want. I'm going to learn Transcendental Meditation. But at that time, maybe I was 16 or so by then, there was no teacher of TM anywhere near me, and I didn't know how you learn TM. There was also, at the same time, a drug culture that was flourishing, and I was a high school student and then a recent high school graduate. And people around me were talking about, very mystical things. They were talking about experiences of going beyond and some huge transcendental opening up that they'd had. And I sort of watched them do that, and I saw that some of them were getting really badly strung out, and they were still pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, I'm going to have the big trip, and then that'll be it, and I'll be there. And I looked at that, and I came up with a set of criteria, really, that were quite specific. I concluded, this is as a 16 or 17-year-old, that there must be a capacity in the human nervous system to maintain an awakened state of consciousness. That must be an inherent capacity of the human nervous system. And these drugs that seem to be triggering something like that are doing something artificial. And because it's artificial, it's doing a violence to the nervous system. So the idea, if I want to be enlightened, if I want to awaken and live in that state of awakenedness, then I can't use drugs for that, because I'm going to, burn up the house that has to contain that awakening. So there was that. Then another part of it, I knew that there were books and practices that talked about what you need to do, and they seemed quite arduous to me. I looked at that and I thought, well, number one, this has to be a natural state, as I imagine this works. So, number two, I'm really lazy, and this is myself as a teenager, and I just, if it's gonna make me have to work too hard, I'm not going to be suited to it. I'm just not the right person for this, but I know that I want the result. So there was somebody that I encountered, and I was talking to him. I must have been maybe 17. And he commented something about meditation and transcendental meditation, and he was doing transcendental meditation. And I said, oh, can you tell me how to do it? And he said, yeah. And he said, what you do is you lie down, and you tense up all of your muscles. And then you relax your muscles, starting at the tips of your toes, very gradually, one muscle at a time, until you're completely relaxed, and that's transcendental meditation. And I thought, phooey. I thought something a little more colorful than that. And I forgot about it completely. And just, it doesn't exist. That isn't going to work. That's not something that I can make work.
They called that progressive relaxation. It was kind of popular in those days.
Yeah, I found that out later.
Yeah.
But it was too much work for me. So then I went to school. I went to college at Indiana University. And not very long after that, I was out of my dorm room and came back fairly late, and I was tired and I was mad about something. I don't recall what it was, but there was some going on that didn't work the way I had hoped, and I came stumping back to my room, and I just wanted to go to bed. And I had a roommate there, and he had somebody in the room who was sitting on my bed. Which is so I was really pissed off. And he was talking. He was just a really sweet, very clear-spoken, gentle sort of a person. And, at first I was just tuning him out, just when is this guy going to get off my bed? And he was talking about transcendental meditation. He was talking about TM. And he was explaining it, and he was saying, and the nature of the mind is just to naturally go to whatever is the most satisfying that's available to it. And so TM uses a mantra, a sound, in a way that allows the mind to effortlessly disengage from its outer focus, and it just naturally then just settles down, because as it settles, the more settled it becomes, the more pleasing, the more satisfying that experience, that sensation becomes, until eventually it transcends completely and you experience pure consciousness. And I thought, yeah, that's it, that's what I want. And he had been meditating for 4 months, and I thought that was really just awesome, that there was somebody who had been meditating that long, and he must truly be enlightened. And by the way, today is day before yesterday. It was 42 years since I learned TM. I learned on October 17th, 1971. So I learned TM, and it definitely was, that was the right technique for me. No question about that. And as soon as I could, as you've already read from that little bio, I went to see Maharishi. He was in California every summer at that time, and I spent a month with Maharishi there. A fairly large group there. It's not like I sat right at his elbow, but that was quite profound. And that also was a preliminary course that was required to go to TM teacher training. And so I went to TM teacher training.
So before you go into that, was there anything particularly noteworthy that you want to mention in passing here about anything you experienced, or you want to just kind of carry on and we'll get into that stuff later?
Only that I found that it really matched what Maharishi was talking about. Mm-hmm. It wasn't very long after I started meditating that I really began to find that that transcendental consciousness that you dip into when you meditate, just it became more and more and more familiar. So all the way along, I felt that Maharishi was describing very well how this practice works and what most people can realistically expect to happen if they're regular in the practice.
Yeah. As you know, I interviewed a couple of Ramana Maharshi experts recently, Michael James and David Godman.
Yeah.
And Michael James had an interesting definition of Atma Vichara in self-inquiry, which Ramana was his main teaching, which he said the best interpretation or translation of Vichara is investigation rather than inquiry, which implies a kind of an experiential progression. And then David Godman gave this analogy of if you want to tame a bull and keep it in the barn, don't beat it and you know force it or anything. Just give it some fresh grass, and the bull will follow you into the barn. And you know, so we kind of touched upon the notion of the traditionally described blissful nature of the self, Ananda, and that can be used to our advantage if we go about it properly to just allow the mind to effortlessly fall into that state, because the mind encounters greater charm as it moves in that direction, so it doesn't have to be coerced in any way.
Well, I feel that in popular awakening or Advaita or self-realization culture, the mind tends to be treated as sort of an adversary.
Yeah.
And I think that's problematic, and it reflects, I feel, the need for the most suitable technique for each individual. And that may not always be the same technique, but if a technique requires some amount of you know, sort of straining, or it's uncomfortable, or it's difficult, or it's not bringing that contact, that dipping in to that most silent level, I suggest, you know, that people take a look at TM. In particular, you know, there's this traditional description that the mind is a monkey, and the mind just goes bounding here and there and everywhere, and somehow we have to tame this monkey mind. But if you really know about monkeys, you know that there's a logic to what a monkey does. You know, the monkey goes bounding around, looking for something more interesting. You know, looking for something. So all you have to do to tame a monkey is to give the monkey something really sweet, and the monkey will go there. So this aspect of the nature of the mind, I think, reflects a misunderstanding that has really kind of penetrated and permeated the efforts that we make to try to reach that deep silence. You know, and I watched both of those interviews. I thought they were wonderful. And David Godman was talking about you don't get to that silence by somehow struggling with the mind or fighting with the mind. And of course there's that very often quoted saying that the self reveals itself to itself by itself alone. And it's the attractive power of the bliss consciousness that in any successful practice is going to bring that result, regardless of whether the practice is trying to do something, you know, with the focus, or trying to do something with watching or whatever. It's always going to be the natural tendency of the mind to go to that most satisfying bliss consciousness that's going to bring it there.
Yeah, and in a way you can't blame these teachers who criticize practices and say that they're only going to reinforce the notion of a practicer, because if they're referring to some sort of practice which involves effort, then that indeed it's like trying to calm choppy water by pushing down the waves. You're only going to create more waves. So they're absolutely right in that critique. But not all practices involve doing that, and therefore
That's right.
not all of them do reinforce the sense of a me isolated practicer. Some of them allow those rigid boundaries to dissolve and disappear, leaving the unbounded self in its pure state.
Yeah, it's important not to generalize about practices because they're not all the same. And one person may be particularly well suited to one practice, and another person may be particularly well suited to another practice. I can just tell you that I was just perfectly well suited to the practice that Maharishi taught, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, and ironically, some people they'll do a practice with great ardor and diligence for quite some time, like Adyashanti I'm thinking of. He was gung-ho as much as anybody could be, and really working hard at his meditation, but it involved effort. And finally, his breakthrough came when he just kind of gave up. And there was a slingshot effect, So, maybe that's one way of going about it. You do something which involves struggle and strain, and when you finally get tired of it, you give up, and something profound happens.
Yeah, it's almost like the description of what happens when, this is kind of a reverse metaphor, but the way to get out of quicksand is, if you struggle against the quicksand, you'll end up mired in the quicksand. Mm-hmm. The way to get out of quicksand is to relax and just settle down and be very still, and very slowly, because it's quicksand, it isn't water, just swim very gently, and you'll find that you don't sink into the quicksand.
Interesting.
So, that's, if you're struggling against the mind, then you're mired in the quicksand.
It's also the way to escape a riptide.
Well,
you don't try to swim against the riptide. You'll drown. You just relax, and you'll eventually get drifted off to the side, and then the riptide you'll no longer be in its current.
Well, this is very useful. I'll have to keep that. Yeah, you probably saved my life.
Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So you went off to teacher training.
I did, and I taught TM for a few years full time, and I'm terrible at remembering exactly when something started and when something stopped, and what year it was and all of that. So I can't help you with that. Excuse me. But in any case, I loved that. It was just wonderful to see people from all different backgrounds and situations meditate for the first time. And it was a common experience. I remember one person said, meditated and opened her eyes, and she says, "I feel so relaxed, like I never feel," And somebody else said, "It's like warm water on parched earth," like that. I might, this might be a good time to just give you a little quote. Where did I put that? There it is. This is a friend of ours that's actually a spiritual teacher himself. And he learned...
whom I actually interviewed a few years ago, but we don't have his permission, so I won't mention his name. But you go ahead with the quote.
All right, then. So anyway, he... well, actually, we do have permission. It's Sage Mahasada.
Okay.
In your interview, he's Raven Mahasada. Mm-hmm. And he said, I've been meditating more than 25 years. The meditation I had during the private instruction period, during the very first session of the introductory TM class, was the best meditation sitting I have had in my entire life. That kind of experience left a strong impression and points to something quite profound. A whole new level of something was opened up to me during that time. It brings tears to my eyes just writing about it. Well, it brings tears to my eyes just reading about it. He's such a sweet soul, and I was so just thrilled to get that report from him.
Nice.
And also the local teachers here, the Hartford TM Center teachers, often, well, not often, but from time to time, every few months, someone comes to them, probably about our age, or maybe in some instances a little younger, who's been practicing different practices at different times, often, quite arduously for years and years, very seriously. And they learn TM and they say something like, this is a very sophisticated technique. This is a very good meditation. I had no idea. I just thought TM, TM, TM. Yeah, it's out there, stress release, stress release. But the experienced meditators who've been practicing various kinds of meditation, who then come to TM, often report that they're really very pleased with it.
Yeah.
So,
and incidentally, I just want to mention, this interview isn't gonna be one big commercial for TM. We're, obviously Jerry and I have both benefited from it a lot, and but we're both very open-minded as to the value of other teachings and the legitimacy of whatever path might suit one, as Jerry was saying a little while ago.
That was the commercial break.
Yeah.
And now we can get back to our regularly scheduled program.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say in response to what you just said that it's in a way that the ease and simplicity of it has been a point of criticism for many people, because many people have thought, well, something so easy can't really be heavy duty. In fact, I thought that myself when I first learned, even though I was really profoundly benefiting from it. I thought, okay, well, this is really great, but I got to get onto the real stuff because I want to get enlightened. So I was like looking into joining Zen monasteries and stuff. And this can't really be the ultimate teaching because it's so darn simple. But I eventually changed my thinking on that. But anyway, just the fact that it's simple and effortless doesn't mean that it's lightweight and for kid stuff.
Well, one thing about it is, anywhere you go, a really good teacher is going to say, there's nothing to do.
Right.
You cannot reveal you cannot, by your own efforts, awaken yourself. And, okay.
Which makes it sound like you're saying don't do anything. But there's a subtlety to it. That's not quite what's being said.
The actual technique of transcendental meditation, effortlessness sounds very nice, but the fact of it is a technique that profoundly involves not doing.
Right.
It allows the self to reveal itself. And that's...
And now one might ask, okay, but you're thinking a mantra. Isn't that doing?
Well, that's the technique, and that's why you have to go through the steps of instruction to learn how you make use of that. Excuse me, to allow the mind effortlessly to settle down into that, more blissful silence. So.
Yeah. Okay.
So then, I taught for some few years, and I went ahead and learned the TM Cities program. And there was this project I had, during the time I took off to raise some money to go to this advanced course with Maharishi. I had begun my career as a woodworker and a carpenter, and spent a couple of years learning that. And there was this really important project that people were being called for to build this dome in Iowa. And the call went out. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse. I apologize for that.
That's okay. There's also a plane in the background, but we can hear you okay.
All right. Yeah, I can hear that too.
All right.
So anyway, I came to Fairfield. I came back to Fairfield. I've been there numerous times for that project, which is the Maharishi Patanjali Golden Dome of Pure Knowledge, which is a rather famous structure by now. And it was discovered that I could do things. I could build things. And in a way, I'm more comfortable working with my hands and making things and building things than I am going out and giving lectures and setting up things and that sort of thing. So together with a couple of other people, Max Sutherland and Jeff Murphy, we were in charge of the design and the structural design and the construction of the wall. all the way around. And we had to figure out, there were, I can't remember, 135 windows or something like that, and we had to figure out how to make the arches. Mac was a boat builder, and he knew all about how to make wood go in non-linear shapes, so he mastered that. But I caught the attention of the people that were organizing various projects and was invited to go to Washington, D.C. for some renovation work that was going to be done so that there would be facilities there. And the purpose of this building, this dome, and the purpose of the renovation work that we did to two large facilities in Washington, D.C., was to provide a setting where large numbers of people could meditate and practice the TM Studies program, to try to create coherence in collective consciousness and try to do something to reverse some of the negative trends in the world. There's now quite a bit of research, good published research, I think 50 or so studies in just very standard, well-respected journals, the Journal of Conflict Resolution and sociology journals and psychology journals and so forth, that show that there actually is an effect, and you can work with it. You can bring large groups of people together in conflict areas and have them meditate. You know, they have this saying, I don't know the Sanskrit, but in the vicinity of sattva, enmity ceases, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And you could actually see that work. You get a large group, and they're together for a few weeks or a month or two, and you begin to see in the proximity of that group, you'll see some change if there's a conflict going on, or if there's violent crime or some such thing.
Yeah, and the underlying principle is not just that people are smiling at each other and the ripple effect is going out. It's that consciousness is a fundamental field, really the most fundamental field in creation, and that by having a group of people experience and enliven that within themselves, they enliven that field for the entire vicinity. It's kind of like as if in a forest, the ground in a certain vicinity were somehow made more fertile, then all the plants, begin to benefit from that and begin to grow more heartily. And so that's the idea that criminals just for some reason are a little bit less inclined to commit criminal acts if that field within which they reside has been enlivened a bit.
Right. And that's the field where everything is connected. Ultimately,
right.
There's only one, in physics it would be called the unified field that gives rise to all of the specific fields of matter and energy. In subjective terms, ultimately there's only one consciousness. Mm-hmm. And that, there are names for that. It could be called Brahman, or it could be called transcendental consciousness. But when that's enlivened in one person, then it connects to every other conscious person. And even if that other person is in a very dark state of consciousness, not very awake, because of the fact that there is that connection, it's going to reverberate, it's going to resonate, and it's going to help them wake up. Mm-hmm. We mentioned Ramana Maharshi, and there are many other examples. Mahesh Yogi was another. When you're around them, their influence is not simply by the words that they're saying or by the mood that they create in the room. It's like you're walking into something that's almost liquid, that it has a silence, that has an intensity to it, where you know that there's something at a very deep, universal level that is intensely alive, that it connects you at a deep level inside yourself. It's not like it connects you through the mind or the senses or something like that. It connects you on your own basic fundamental consciousness.
Yeah, it completely reorients you. I mean, and David Godman, of course, was telling stories about Papaji and Nisargadatta and of course Ramana, and that was the main thing, was being in their presence. It wasn't so much what they were saying, and just sort of the influence of being, the osmotic effect of being in their presence is what really transformed you. And a lot of time, and Ramana himself said his main teaching was silence. He didn't just mean not talking. He meant that kind of like deafening silence that is experienced in the presence of someone who is so profoundly established in it.
Yeah, yeah, it's very real. It's very real. Yeah. So then, back to the sequence. I worked for some number of years doing these renovation projects, and during that time, Maharishi developed this semi-monastic program, the Thousand-Headed Purusha program, that you and I both participated in for a number of years. And I can't tell you when you could say, joined that group, because we were just absorbed into it. We were just told, okay, you're in the Purusha program now. And I don't know when that was. It just, somewhere along the way. And I was there for some number of years. The thing about that, number one, there was intensive practice for, some hours every day. And also...
Yeah, like sometimes 6-8 hours a day or something.
Yeah. And we were also just completely immersed in Maharishi's teaching. At times he was with us. When he wasn't with us, whatever discourses he had done, almost everything Maharishi ever said is audio taped or videotaped. And this is being organized now, and it might take another decade or so before it all really gets completely organized and indexed. And but there's a tremendous trove of material there, and we would have the videotapes as they were coming out. So every night for some number of hours after whatever work we were doing or whatever practice we had done, we would just be immersed in that. And I feel as though that was the period when I was able to sort of connect the things that Maharishi was saying and the ways that he was talking about things that sounded really quite abstract and maybe technical, talking about Vedic literature or how the Vedic syllables emerge from the primordial base of that the universe comes out of, and very abstract kind of sounding things. But I began to realize that Maharishi spoke in a way that could be meaningful on numerous levels simultaneously. And I sort of caught on. The way I would put it is, at some point, I decided, well, he's been talking about this stuff and talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And I've been thinking, well, he's just got this fascination with this Veda thing. And he just goes on and on and on about it. And then I thought, well, he's making me sit here and listen to this. I think it's conceivable that he's actually trying to tell me something. And that was a kind of a breakthrough. And I started to think, okay, he's saying this. How does that relate to me? How does that relate to my experience? How does that relate to my life? And in that context, a lot of what Maharishi talked about just came to life and really set the tone that has been the focus, really, of the rest of my life. One thing that I think is significant is people have a tendency to think of quote-unquote experiences of consciousness or awakening to be something that you meditate and you do your practice and you look at what that was like and what happened there, and that's your experiences. And then you just go about your day and you do whatever you're doing. But it's all experience. And the principles, this especially might be meaningful to the TM community, because we have a tendency to just do our program and then go out and just forget about program. But it's all interconnected. And the things that Maharishi said about consciousness and how consciousness and higher states of consciousness unfold and how consciousness interacts with consciousness and all that, that's happening all the time. That's happening 24/7. So that really had set kind of the way that I go about and have gone about now for some decades, living my life and approaching just anything that happens that comes along.
Okay.
I left Purusha, I think it was around 1993. I had a health breakdown for a period, and I needed to deal with that. And so I had to leave. I had to leave Purusha, and I was just devastated because my complete identity was, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I'm this Vedic monk, and that's it. And the only way that I possibly could have gone and gone out of Purusha is if something had forced me to go. And I found, it took me a while to readjust and sort of find my identity in a maybe a little more universal way. But I'm a little distracted here. I'm forgetting what I'm doing. And I'm feeling left out. I've got a door over here, but there are no animals that want to come in and out. I'm not getting enough attention here. So maybe I can get one of the children to bring the dog, and he can scratch on the door, and then we'll be symmetric. So
you left Purusha.
Yeah, and I'm trying to piece that back together again. What I found, I remember where I was going with that. What I found was that I really had received a pretty complete package of practices and understanding and reference from the things that I had been immersed in from Maharshi's teaching. And it was enough. You could say, oh, it would be better if you didn't have to leave and all that. But that's just the way it was. And there's a way where, everything is as it should be. And that clearly, even though it was traumatic in a way for me to have to make that transition, I found that I had the whole world. I was no longer in this somewhat closed environment. And lo and behold, everything that Maharshi had talked about, I found just reverberating and resonating through everything that I encountered, and that's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful process and a wonderful journey, which never ends. It's still going on, and it just gets wonderfuler and wonderfuler.
Yeah.
So that's that.
Cool. Now, I know you kind of want to, I don't know, there's a delicate balance here between talking about your own experience and talking about these principles of knowledge that pertain to your experience. And there are a lot of teachers and spiritual people, like if you interview the Dalai Lama, he's not going to say, I'm in this state of consciousness and so on, because there's a certain humility, and it's actually built into the Buddhist tradition that you don't make proclamations. So we'll proceed, and I think people can perhaps, your words can speak for themselves, and if they convey some authority on the base, some experiential authority as opposed to just philosophical familiarity with the things we're talking about, then if that comes through to people, then fine, they can pick it up that way. If they think that you're just kind of a philosophically astute guy, then and they want to leave it at that, then okay, they can do that too.
Sure, and some people think I'm not such a philosophically astute guy.
Right.
I think I'm really full of beans.
So you sent me in the notes you sent me about what we might talk about. The next thing you mentioned were 7 major states of consciousness, and the confusion about states, which has led to the idea that experiences of higher states of consciousness are inevitably transient. And as we'll discuss, Maharshi outlined 7 major states of consciousness. I don't know if that's the only valid roadmap. I'm sure there are other ways of breaking it down.
There are other dimensions that you can also map, and I've seen some of the people that you've interviewed do that and just beautifully, and it really kind of fills in a picture of quite a wonderfully complex humanity as it goes through this expansion of all of the potentials on all of the dimensions that are there.
Yeah. And there's no end to the degree of detail one can investigate. I mean, you can, if somebody asks you how do you get from New York to L.A. or New York to San Francisco, you can say, well, take I-80, and that's the short version of the explanation. But then, obviously, the details can be expanded to never-ending degrees if you want to really map out the trip in precise detail. So the whole thing about states of consciousness. Maharshi's 7 states analogy or 7 states structure is a bit of a take I-80 explanation, but he went into it in some detail. But still, people who now have actually experientially traversed that map say, well, there's a lot more richness and detail than I first anticipated.
Exactly, and I think that's such an important point, and it's about pointers. Inevitably, the description of a reality is always going to be different from the reality. And it's really important not to attach yourself to the expectation that you've developed. No matter how familiar you are with the description and no matter how clearly you understand intellectually, and I'm not suggesting that means you've misunderstood it, but the actual reality is always different. It's always bigger. It's often complex in situations where you thought something was going to be completely simple. You thought that the whole world was just somehow going to be some kind of homogeneous, dissolve into pure being. And guess what? It did. The whole world dissolved into pure being, and it's still there. All the diversity and all. You find out that as you get on a granular level, that there's almost more diversity. There's almost more going on, and everything is completely simple.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the development of these states of consciousness, as Maharshi delineated them, there is this tendency to kind of pin a very simplistic expectation, and that causes some, I would say, confusion, because sometimes people really kind of don't know where they are because they think, oh, well, this is going to have to be exactly like this. The other thing I'll say about this is the descriptions. This is characteristic of the Vedic literature. It's characteristic of Buddhist literature. I think it's almost universal that the descriptions of something will tend to be cut and dried. You'll say, for example, in Buddhism, that this kind of awakened person, there's a certain name for it, and I don't know that tradition, so I don't have the names in my memory. That person is only going to be born again once, and then they'll be enlightened. And this category is going to be enlightened in this lifetime, but they're only a middling level, and they're really not qualified to teach. And this one is at a higher level, and they're qualified to teach, and it goes like that. But the gradations, it's not like you just walk through a door and now you're in a different place. It's a kind of more of a sliding scale, and there's a lot like that as these states of consciousness unfold. They may blend a little bit one into another. They may come along in a kind of gradual way, so it isn't really quite clear when a certain threshold was crossed. So it's important not to pin too tightly to those very precise descriptions and expectations.
Yeah. A couple of comments here. One is something you said a minute ago, which is that if when the actual experience dawns, it may not resemble your expectations, such that you might not actually realize it had dawned. I don't know. Like I'm thinking of Suzanne Siegel's book, Collision with the Infinite, where she had actually been a TM teacher and all that. She had all that knowledge, but then she kind of drifted away from it. And at a certain point, she was getting on a bus in Paris, and all of a sudden, she had this profound awakening into what we would call cosmic consciousness, and it totally freaked her out. Because there was this loss of a personal self, and she tried for 10 years to locate a personal self, and she had no idea what was happening to her. She thought she was crazy. The whole thing had actually been explained to her in minute detail some years prior, but obviously she had formed a conception of it which didn't match the reality of it, and so it caused her a lot of sort of disturbance. And
let's go through the actual how this unfolds.
Okay.
The first thing I'll say here, we have good understanding of the development that happens in a human being.
Who's we?
Civilization.
Okay.
We have embryology, which is a very highly developed science, such that, every cell as it differentiates, it's known that, this group of cells is going to differentiate into these organs and so forth, and the brain begins to develop in certain ways at a certain number of days and weeks and so forth into gestation and so forth. We've got that map, and we've absolutely got it. We have it with developmental psychology, where, we know what an infant, to pretty good degree, we know at what stage the infant begins to recognize that it can control things in its environment. That's when they like to start throwing things. And watch, it landed over there, But, there's a development through the stages of childhood and adolescence and so forth. Moral reasoning begins to develop at a certain stage. And that's known. There's a good map. And, of course, it's deepening all the time. But we have a good sense of that unfoldment. What we don't have as a culture or a body of knowledge is a good systematic understanding of further unfoldment, which I have to say I'm absolutely certain is just as natural as the development of an embryo. It's just as natural as those stages of childhood development. And I think in the future, perhaps some decades as we go along, but I think in the future, hopefully, this will begin to be mapped in a similar way, and it'll become just kind of standard.
It seems like some cultures had mapped it, maybe certain ancient cultures, but it's such a different language, and the culture was so different that we haven't been able to translate it into our current culture and language. And we read these Vedic texts and all, and it's just there sort of needs to be a new seed to yield a new crop.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about it is that these states of consciousness are uncommon. And it doesn't mean that they're abnormal or unnatural.
Right.
You could almost think of it as a kind of arrested development. But if we think in terms of lifetimes, then it seems more natural that this development just takes longer, and it may take more than a lifetime, and you may not see it if you just look at the average of humanity.
And if they were common, I mean, if 90% of the people in the world were in some stage of awakening or enlightenment, then it would be like, what's the big deal? We understand this, and our psychologists and so on would have it all very nicely mapped out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to make this simple, I'm going to pin this to some background that may be familiar to people that have some background in the Vedic or yoga or Vedanta traditions, because that's what I'm familiar with. But very simply, we can number them. The first state of consciousness is deep sleep. And the nature of deep sleep is that the senses are asleep, the mind is asleep, and the body is basically inert, is not active. you can find that in the Upanishads. It's called Sushupta. Not much to say about it. Then a different state of consciousness is dreaming, which is the second state of consciousness. In Sanskrit, that's called swapna or taijasa. And in dreaming state of consciousness, the mind is awake, but the senses are asleep. So there's, a lot of experience, but that experience is only happening internally, in the mind. And you say, asleep to the world. So the outer world is not accessible to that state of consciousness. And then the waking state of consciousness, which is called Jagrat or Vishva. Vishva means world, so it's interesting that it's quite a common saying, oh, he was asleep to the world. Well, okay, being awake is called, in Sanskrit, being awake to the world, like that. So those are the three, you could say, common states of consciousness or relative states of consciousness. Everyone experiences them. And the significant thing about a state of consciousness is that as a general principle, they're mutually exclusive. There can be some, drifting in between and so forth. But generally speaking, if you're in the dreaming state of consciousness, you're dreaming. You can't wake yourself up from a dream by dreaming that you woke up. All that'll happen if you dream you woke up is that you might find yourself in a dream room that you woke up in.
I've done that.
Yeah.
I've dreamt that I got up and brushed my teeth and did all my bathroom stuff, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm still sleeping.
Exactly. Yeah. So these states of consciousness, each one is really complete and in a way self-sufficient. So you can't just simply decide that, okay, now I'm going to go from this state of consciousness to this state of consciousness to this state of consciousness. You may be, have some way that you go to sleep that works for you every time, but it's not because you sit there and somehow think sleep and then you're asleep. And that's important to understand. Now, then there's the fourth state of consciousness, which is also described in the same Upanishads, which is transcendental pure consciousness. And that is just silence.
Turiya, right?
Turiya. Sometimes samadhi it's called. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means samadhi without sensation. Mm-hmm. And that's the state where the mind is completely silent, the senses are completely silent, but consciousness is fully awake. And that's that state of transcendental consciousness that has the quality of bliss consciousness. And that's, if you want to say, the goal of a meditation practice is to develop that contact, to dip into that samadhi and cultivate the ability of the nervous system to sustain that. Now, in the Upanishads, then there's something that's called Turiyatita, which literally means beyond the fourth. And that's a general expression, and we can discuss what is beyond the fourth, and we'll discover that there are several stages beyond the fourth, which we can find reference to in other parts of the Vedic literature. So, gradually, with experience of that contact with the fourth state of consciousness, it begins to develop that one can sustain that inner silence, that eternal, unbounded inner reality simultaneously while one is doing things, thinking thoughts, active. And eventually that becomes stabilized, and it's a permanent state of consciousness. And that state of consciousness, Maharishi called cosmic consciousness. The words cosmic consciousness have been used in other ways by other teachers, so it can be a little bit confusing. But there's the word in Sanskrit, what is the word? Sakshi, which means witness. And you can call it witness consciousness. You can say that the pure consciousness now is understood to be myself. That's my real self. My you could say the sublime self is that pure eternal consciousness. And a transformation takes place where everything that had previously been considered to be me is seen through and discovered to be just some phenomenal thing going on. You know, my mind, it isn't me. I thought that was me. My little ego that motors around and feels important about itself. You realize, oh, that's not what I am. I thought I was this little me, but so the whole psychology, all of the individuality, is now seen, experienced in a permanent way as not being what I really am, not being who I really am. And from that inner silence, then the whole outer world is seen as being transient, transitory. The way that one describes this may vary according to one's background and the teaching that one has come through. Some would look at that and just say it all doesn't exist. It's all just illusion. You know, the ego, the mind, it's all nothing. It isn't real. It's just, nothing moving within nothing, and I'm completely beyond that. Or in traditions where this isn't thought of as the self, then it would just be this great vastness is there, and somehow that's my my abode, and everything else is just other than that, and it has this unreality about it. Maharishi didn't talk about the manifest in quite such a dismissive tone. He talked about 200%, that we take up residence, as it were, in the true self, which is called Atman. And from there, the outer world continues, and we have 100% of the outer and 100% of the inner. So there are different ways of, excuse me. There are different ways of talking about that and different ways of approaching it. But it's still the same thing. It's this awakening of the silent, infinite, eternal base within. And then everything else that is outer is seen to be not that. In terms of the personality, subjectively, the personality gets pushed to the surface. I used to think I was, this guy and, these characteristics of personality and so forth. But then when I, become what I really am, which is infinite, unbounded, silent, eternal Atman, then I see, oh, those things are kind of on the outside almost. I'm way, way deep in here, kind of looking out at that, which is out there. That's a description of what we're calling cosmic consciousness. And that's kind of the first permanent awakening. It's rare. It's extremely uncommon if you just look at the population of people. We encounter, more people that are in that state because,
we travel in those circles.
We have the ability to network, and and so like-minded people are able to coalesce. But even though it's extremely rare, it's still just one unfoldment. It's just that first permanent awakening.
Yeah.
And a very important thing about this is it is a major state of consciousness. And as I said, the nature of a major state of consciousness is it is complete. It is self-sufficient. It has its own perfect, logical, structure, if you will, of how everything fits together. And cosmic consciousness is a big deal. Okay? If you've been going along, overshadowed by the illusory world, living in the state of, you could call it identification, where whatever one is involved with, that's what I am. You know, I'm a businessman, I'm a teacher, I'm a carpenter, and I identified with that. And if you take those things away from me, then I feel like my existence is threatened. You go from that to the state where I am eternal. I am absolute. I am unbounded. I am untouched by all of this. That's a very big deal. And there's a temptation, if you will. If we don't have this whole map, and that's why I feel that this map is so important, without knowing that that's really just a
good start.
A way station. You know, that's, what do they call it? A base camp halfway up the mountain.
Right.
That isn't the whole enchilada. Without that map, and in the absolute certainty that I am awakened, because you are, then people will go and teach. And the teachings will often say, and these are valid things to teach, give up the separate self. There's no me. You know, there's nobody there, you know. And there's a lot of that teaching. It's problematic, for one thing, because people will tend to try to create that by somehow trying to erase the mind and trying to erase the ego and trying to erase the personality, trying to get rid of all of it, in the absence of the direct awakening of that pure awareness. And that gets people stranded because they've done something to themselves psychologically that is disconnecting them from the only world that they inhabit. You know, in order for this witnessing, this I am untouched by everything awakening to be real, the self has to awaken. You can't construct that awakening by working on those elements that eventually are going to be transcended. You can only do it by transcending them.
And it's very much an experiential thing. It's not conceptual or intellectual. I just want to emphasize that because there's so many people who, you know, they go about it by listening to these teachers and reading these books and dwelling on the concepts and getting kind of a little bit hypnotized by those concepts, so familiar that they get good at talking about them. They get good at expressing those concepts, and they get on the chat groups and start teaching, you know, and pontificating there.
And it's important to have these concepts. It's important to sense and know, okay, there is this ahead of me, you know, and that's something that I aspire to. Mm-hmm. But it's important not to become attached, again, to those pointers.
Yeah.
It's so important.
That's the old Zen finger pointing at the moon, you know, analogy.
It's not the moon.
And you know, why don't you touch a little bit on, you mentioned witnessing, why don't you touch upon the notion of witnessing sleep as a sort of an acid test for this actually being an experiential reality and not just conceptual?
Yeah. So this Atman, this silent, eternal, infinite self that has awakened in cosmic consciousness, awakens permanently. And we've talked about how pure consciousness is maintained during activity. You know, now two states of consciousness are being maintained simultaneously. Pure consciousness and Vishva, you know, waking state, the world. But it also is maintained through dreaming. So you witness your dreams. You know, John Hagelin, when he talks about higher states of consciousness, he'll say, he'll talk about witnessing deep sleep. and he'll say something like, sleep becomes very pleasant. I highly recommend it. It done so there. So what happens is that pure consciousness is never lost, even during dreaming, which is a clearer kind of experience, because you wake up from that and you think, oh, I was awake, I was there in my true self, and I was dreaming. Somehow the mind was doing the dreaming thing. But then deep sleep becomes essentially the same as the Turiya state. Deep sleep becomes what samadhi would have been before the capacity to maintain pure consciousness together with activity. So that silence, which is beyond time and space, is there even during deepest sleep. And different people experience that with different amounts of clarity. Some people will just say, I knew I was there the whole time. Other people will say, well, the way I know that I was there is the continuity. It was there because you don't experience time when you're in deep sleep. And there was no sense that I was ever not there. And that thread of self is completely unbroken through all of, like the thread in a rosary that goes through the beads of the rosary, and it's completely continuous like that.
Anyway, it's a good acid test, because you can't maintain a concept while you're sleeping, and so if this realization is conceptual, it's not really the realization, and the sort of the criterion of having actually experientially awoken to it is that awareness is not going to be lost throughout the night.
And awakening is exactly the right word for it. You awaken. Right. So, when you awake from dreaming, you don't expect to wake up. You may start to have, a little waking and going back to sleep, and a little waking, going back to sleep. And that happens with this also. You may have glimpses, and those glimpses may become more frequent and longer, where you go into that and out of it and in it and out of it. But you never know from minute to minute. You just wake up. You wake up and you look at the clock. Oh, it's 6 o'clock. Okay, I guess I got to get up. Or, oh, it's 4:30. I guess I'll go back to sleep. That's what awakening is like. You cannot build an awakening in the mind by working with it intellectually and conceptually and trying to create a model of awakening. So then, from there, you have the self, which is eternal, absolute, unchanging. You have the world, which is material, objective, it's out there, and it is not eternal and unchanging. And from there, a very similar progression takes place as the progression when one transcends thought and eventually reaches the self, which is that first our perception of the world is on the surface of things. But because now there's this connection with the deepest level within that also creates the capacity to see more deeply. And as the perception of the outer world becomes deeper and more subtle, the same thing happens that we were talking about in the beginning, which is that the attention goes to more and more pleasing levels. Subtler is more pleasing. Subtler is more unbounded. Subtler is closer to that pure level where everything is bliss.
But now we're not talking about during meditation, we're talking about during activity.
And we're not talking about inner. We're talking about
eyes open,
seeing the world, seeing finer and finer and finer values of the world, of the objects of perception. And the heart opens up. And that's a very powerful force. The heart, the heart can overtake anything. So, what have we got there?
A bird.
That's got to be a crow. Can you hear it?
Yep.
Yep. So he's giving his discourse.
Yes, the crow
So,
approves.
Yeah, or disapproves. I think he disapproves. So you begin to approach that same silence that you found within yourself at the subtlest level of what you see outside. And every perception, every contact, every experience of anything in the material world, even the scolding of a black crow, becomes delightful. And as that develops, the characteristic of devotion opens up. And that devotion can manifest itself in infinitely many different ways. That will be a reflection of each person's own personality. It may come out as a deep devotion in a religious sense and the concept of God or a particular form of God that is precious to that individual, that awakening individual. It may be like that. It may be in a more generalized sort of way that just the heart goes out and is completely overtaken with devotion to the perfection and the beauty of everything that is encountered. That is called God consciousness in the way Maharishi describes this. And God consciousness, as it develops, is more, it involves the psychology, it involves the whole personality. And it's a territory where it's not as easy to find clear delineations, clear transition points from one thing to another. That experience of finer and finer values of perception of the outer world, that can start even before cosmic consciousness. That devotion, that may be already very well developed in a person, and it just simply deepens and comes to its fulfillment somewhere along the way. It's more of a continuum that reaches its fulfillment in the awakening of what Maharishi called unity consciousness or Brahman consciousness.
Might be added that, even though some people are very devotional by nature and develop to a great extent before self-realization, there's a certain kind of a impediment to the full blossoming of that if the self hasn't been realized, because who is it that's appreciating this thing? If I don't know who I am, who is it that appreciates the tree or the flower or the crow? So the devotion can really begin to take off after the self has been realized, because there's a foundation for it.
And ultimately what that devotion wants is to be unified, to be one. And that unification can only happen on the ground of the fully awakened self. Because, as we talked in the beginning, there's only one consciousness. And on that level, everything is connected. So, to be united with my beloved, to be united with my God, that happens on the level of unbounded, pure consciousness, which has to be awakened in order for all of that devotion to really come to its fulfillment. And here is a beautiful thing. It's impossible. The world is the material world. And the senses are the material senses. And they can take our perception to finer and finer and finer values, but they're still the senses, and the world is still the world. It's the heart that does this impossible thing of bridging across that impossible chasm and unites everything in the entire universe within the self. It's the heart that does that.
Beautiful.
So now we're talking about the seventh major state of consciousness. And this, I would say, is the full awakening with an asterisk. It never ends. It always will keep unfolding. But after this, the unfoldment is just going to be expansion and deepening, integration, but that also never ends. So the seventh major state of consciousness is a state of consciousness where at one time there was the self and there was the non-self, inner and outer, real, unreal, absolute, relative, eternal, temporal. But in unity consciousness, in Brahman consciousness, myself is the self of all. There's only one self. And in Sanskrit, and we see this, I was going through from the Vedic perspective, we had the names in Sanskrit of these four states of consciousness. Fifth state of consciousness is when Atma is fully awake. Atma is that infinity, that infinite unbounded self within. And then we have one of the great sayings, one of the Mahavakyas, Atma is Brahman. Brahman is the great. It is the all-inclusive. And one discovers that this Atman, which was once inner, is actually all-encompassing. And there's nothing that is outside of the self. Everything is within myself. Everything is myself. There is no other. And now I and my beloved are truly one. So that's the seventh major state of consciousness. Some people will experience these sequentially, and they'll be very clear, and someone can say, yeah, there was this period of time where I felt really completely uninvolved with everything, and there was this great silence, and everything just went along on the outside, and it just was like that. And then that changed into something else, and I started to have a different relationship with the world, and things became more fascinating. And then that changed into something else, and I found that it was all me, you know. You'll have people describe like that. Some people awaken all at once. Some people awaken right into Brahman consciousness. Some people awaken spontaneously, without any practice at all. They may go through some sort of a crisis that brings them out of the world and brings them to the inner self. There may be no such thing. They may be just motoring along and poof, whoa, you know, what happened? And there may be a gradation where it really isn't quite clear anywhere along the way, because one thing just very gradually, I think you called that the oozing pattern.
Oozers, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not as though this description is somehow going to just unmistakably describe, you know, point by point exactly how each person is going to experience this. But I feel completely that this is just an unfoldment of human development that's in the DNA. You know, it may express itself a little differently in this person and a little differently in that person, but I do feel very strongly that this unfoldment is built into a human nervous system. It's a fundamental part of human life.
You mentioned that, you know, some people might awaken to Brahman, just like that. If they do, then is there a sort of a catch-up period where certain developmental stages that ordinarily would precede awakening to Brahman have to be brought into line, and so they...
There is anyway.
Uh-huh.
This also is different for different people. Let me define something here, because I'm using the word Brahman, and in Orthodox usage, there's more than one way to use that word, so I want to be clear about this. Sometimes it's used to refer to an underlying, all-encompassing universal reality that is sort of out there. And that's not the sense that I'm using it. We might be able to call that para-Brahman. But Maharshi said, we also have this Mahavakya, Brahman is the knower. Very important. Pragyanam Brahma. Brahman is the knower. Maharshi said, there is no Brahman without a knower of Brahman. There is no Brahman without a human knower of Brahman. Brahman is a human being in Brahman consciousness. And there are several things that are important about that. One is, Brahman is all-encompassing. Brahman is that which accepts everything and rejects nothing. And there's a fairly well-known saying, Brahman is the eater of everything. Brahman devours everything. It does that. It devours everything as the human knower of Brahman, such that all of the territory of a life is incorporated into that wholeness. And in the process, this is kind of an interesting thing, because the experience of Brahman consciousness is complete. That's the nature of a state of consciousness. And the nature of Brahman consciousness is it's all-inclusive. It contains everything. Everything is now within Brahman, and you can't find an out there. You can't find an outer anywhere. So what about things that still need to be worked out? What about what you were saying? Is there some catching up that needs to be done? In general, everything is within the self. But whatever needs to be done, whatever project there might be, whether I have to work through my relationship with my parents, or whether I have to develop some skills in the world, or whatever those things are, whatever sort of work there is to be done, that all happens within Brahman. And there's a paradox. Brahman is complete. Brahman is infinite. And Brahman, as that infinity, cannot be any different than that complete infinity. And Brahman is ever expanding. It's completely paradoxical, and that's the nature, especially of that highest state of awakening, that every paradox, the world doesn't exist, and there it is. Every paradox you can think of, just cheerfully, happily, with absolutely no problem whatsoever, is there within Brahman. Paradoxes are no problem for Brahman.
You've probably heard me say on some of these shows that I love the word paradox, and I probably ought to get a T-shirt made with the word paradox on it. Well, somebody sent me one this last week. I should have worn it. So thank you, whoever that was. I'll wear it to the Science and Non-Duality Conference.
Yeah. So this brings up the very important territory of Lesha Vidya.
Yeah, and just before just to give a concrete illustration to what you just said, I mean, everything is concluded within Brahman, and ouch, damn it, I just stubbed my toe,
Yeah.
and that happens within the wholeness, within Brahman. But so that wholeness, that Brahman doesn't negate relative experiences, some of which can be, quite difficult.
Yeah, and I am everything, and everything is within myself, and it's a complete oneness. And I've got this attitude that I still have that I just isn't really very good, and I just need to work on myself because I still have that. And I'm everything,
Right.
People come along and think because they have a preconception that an awakened state is going to be this pure, pristine perfection, that they assume, okay, I'm awakened, I don't have any more work to do. I'm done. I'm cooked. So then you see people, kind of getting themselves into predicaments because, maybe there is something there that has come along that they really should be working on.
Yeah.
And the word Lesha Vidya is familiar to people that are familiar with Maharshi's teaching, but it may be less familiar to others. The word Lesha Vidya means the faint remains of ignorance. Lesha is faint remains, and avidya is ignorance. And you combine them and you have the word Lesha Vidya. Maharshi said, there is no Brahman without Lesha Vidya. He said it's a cruelty. It's a cruel thing to say that Lesha Vidya is the basis of Brahman consciousness. But you can't, now I'm not quoting Maharshi, you can't be Brahman, which is the totality lived by a human being. You can't be Brahman unless you still retain enough illusion to continue to imagine that you're a separate human being. You can't be Brahman without that faint remains. So, somehow the universe, the unbounded infinite consciousness, manages to see through these eyes and type with these fingers on this keyboard. And that's possible through the agency of Lesha Vidya. So,
right, because if you really wanted to boil it down to the ultimate reality, there are no eyes, there is no keyboard.
we just all melt into
it's
oneness.
just sort of homogeneous wholeness with no differentiation, no distinction. But if that's going to be the reality, then there's no functioning, there's no living.
This is much more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, here's a really important thing. Everything is as it should be. Everything is perfect. We have this kind of militant way of talking about the mind. You must destroy the mind. And only when the mind is destroyed will you be liberated. Only when the ego is destroyed will you be liberated. The mind is part of the perfection of the universe. The ego, that's a bad word. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna use the E word. The ego is part of the perfection of the universe. And as these states of consciousness unfold, one transcends the mind and the ego. One sees through them. One gets, these are illusory. These aren't the real me. But it is through the agency of these illusions that it's possible to become enlightened, that it's possible to become fully awakened. Now, people that are familiar with this teaching about Lesha Vidya often have the idea, if someone is enlightened, then that faint remains of ignorance, that must be just some really very mystical kind of ignorance. That ignorance must be something completely different from anything that I know of, that I would call ignorance. But it isn't. It's just ignorance. However much ignorance you brought along with you, when you cross that threshold and awaken into Brahman, that's Lesha Vidya.
Oh, really? I mean, that amount doesn't get diminished further over time?
Absolutely it does.
Yeah.
And this is how Brahman continues to expand. This is
Right.
Brahman devouring everything.
Yeah, so the remains can get fainter and fainter, but there's always got to be some remains.
They do.
If you're
And
going
at first,
live.
it may be pretty a lot. You know, there's in the Zen tradition, I think they say, for the first 10 years after somebody awakens, you kind of keep your eye on them because they kind of stink of enlightenment and they're not quite, completely ripe yet. Mm-hmm. Well, Lesha Vidya comes along. Now, how could this work? How could you have the ignorance all completely thinned down to almost nothing and then awaken? You're just going to awaken, and that's going to burn away. So it's a progression. Ego thins out, and we can find in some exemplary teachers that the ego is just so thin, just the faintest gossamer thin amount. But still, they would be interested in things. They would have motivations. They clearly knew where and who and what they were in relation to the outer world. But there's always going to be something there. A couple of words that are helpful are ahankara and asmita. Ahankara means the sense of I and mine, and that's the Sanskrit word that often is used to translate ego. And it's just the little me, Asmita refers to the sort of accumulation of conditionings that color that little me in ways that give the ego a bad reputation, that make it egotistical. And asmita becomes thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. But ahankara, if you look into the Vedic literature, ahankara is part of nature. You have the 8 prakritis of nature, which the finest is buddhi, or sometimes called mahat, and then ahankara, and then manas, and then the 5 senses, or the 5 elements. Well, that's throughout everything. That's part of that's baked in the cake. I want to just talk for a minute specifically about Ramana Maharshi and some things that David Godman said last week that I think are quite significant. I was quoting Ramana Maharshi when I said, the ego must be destroyed to be liberated. The mind must be destroyed to be liberated. And I wrote this down because I wanted to be sure to get it word for word. This is David Godman quoting. He said, when Bhagavan said mind has to go, he's not talking about thoughts, which is interesting. Bhagavan would often sit there and someone would walk in. He'd say, oh, I was thinking about you and you showed up. Thoughts were still there. Mind for him, as the mechanism that coordinated all your thoughts, decided it was a person inside a body and saw a world outside of itself. That, I really feel, is the key to this. He said that the whole superstructure is a creation. It's a badly running, badly functioning program in your brain, if you like. This whole idea, there's someone in there who sees something out there, that the person in there has to choose how to decide and interact with what's out there. He said that's mind. He said the world as an external entity ceases. That's Brahman consciousness. That's Brahman consciousness. And clearly, there were mental processes going on, and I would look at that and say, well, okay, I would say Ramana had a mind, but Ramana is defining mind as that agency that divides inner from outer. Well, ego does that also. So what happens is mind, if I'm allowed to use the word, is absorbed into Brahman. It dissolves in Brahman. But paradox, even dissolved in Brahman, it continues to be able to perform its role. We can still have thoughts. Ego is absorbed into Brahman. And I think Ramana would say the ego has been destroyed. I don't think that there's a contradiction. I don't think there's a conflict. And the other thing is also in David Godman's interview, I believe I heard him say quite clearly, Ramana understood and taught that in the ordinary state of ignorance, it's useless to try to wrestle with the mind and try to wrestle with the ego. It's useless. It's only by what was the phrase?
Inquiry?
Self-inquiry, yeah.
Atma-vichara.
Yeah, Atma-vichara. It's only by Atma-vichara that you can destroy the ego. It's only by Atma-vichara that you can destroy the mind. I agree 100%. With this little caveat that the word destroy is a very sort of militant word. They get absorbed into the wholeness, and inner and outer is destroyed. There's no inner, there's no outer.
Drop a sugar cube into some water and it gets destroyed, but the sugar is still in there.
Yeah. And it's still able to have the taste of sweetness.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, just something that I might be interesting to do. I've collected 3 or 4 descriptions from people that report that they are awakened, and I haven't attached the names with these, but some of them are people that you know and even have interviewed. One person said, a flood of instantaneous knowing came all at once, that you and I and all of us are that. No one higher, no one lower. Love is the calling card of this reality. And the same person, as she went through the stages of this, went through a stage where she very strongly had the feeling, I don't exist, there's no me. You know, the ego is completely gone, there's nothing, there's only this vastness. And she said, in the beginning, I was so annoyed with this leftover personality, you know, because people attach themselves to the idea that they must completely wring out every last drop of individuality. But you can't, you know, and people get stranded there. And there's a problem that comes up, and it's a big problem, because if you're in that witnessing from Atma state where you can say, well, all there is this vastness and everything doesn't exist. You know, there's no me, there's no ego. If you're in that state and you're indoctrinated into I'll use the word dogma, that awakening means there's nobody there. If you're really attached to that, then you're not going to be open to the possibility that maybe there's still an ego, because that's antithetical to what you believe. I'm awakened, therefore I have no ego. And
conversely, I detect some ego here, therefore I couldn't be awakened.
also true. Or I detect some ego in you, therefore you couldn't be awake.
Right.
So there are situations that arise where a teacher is just so confident, and the people around him are saying, well, this is really egotistical. This guy is... And once in a while, you have a very courageous teacher who realizes, oh, wait a minute, I've been deluding myself here. I actually do have a personality, and there actually is an ego in there. Well, this individual was not so tenacious with that, but that way of looking at that stage of awakening, the way station, the base camp station stage. She came in with that orientation, and then looking around, said, "Well, there's still somebody here." I thought it was completely gone, but and it becomes more subtle because obviously you're working on the level of pure awareness where these things are just functioning within awareness. They're not these hard, solid material things like they once have been. But she said in the beginning, I was so annoyed by this leftover personality. I love that. Someone else said, this is someone you know. You can probably tell me who it is. When I awakened, I saw God is not separate from me. God is the ground of my very being. Everywhere I look, I see God is in everything, and everything is in God. Okay, you can tell me who said that.
I don't know.
That was Francis.
Francis. Okay, great.
Yeah, Francis Bennett, whose whole life was oriented towards devotion and lived for a number of years as a Catholic monk.
Right.
And then one day, this is the last one, one day the world took on a luminous glow as I was walking. The trees sparkled with amazing light, and the colors became brilliant and more vibrant than in our normal reality. I could see my feet stepping on the pavement, yet I was not moving. I passed a woman on the street and felt immense love for her. I felt her as myself. Cars passing by reflected brilliant light off their bumpers that seemed almost blinding. Everything was moving within me, the trees, the woman, and the cars. I was all of this. Someone spoke to me, and I heard myself speak, yet I didn't say a word. I was not moving, yet walking and talking was happening. I knew myself as stillness through which all movement occurs. Samadhi, bliss, grace, exquisite beauty. This world is the other world. The other world is this world, and it exists as us. This brought a vast opening of the heart that now knew itself as the totality, including the body, mind, and the world. No separation anywhere. All is perfectly divine.
Nice. Who said that one?
Oh, what is her name? I haven't got her name clear in my mind. It's a wonderful, lovely woman. Someone that I found on social media that just friended me about 2 weeks ago.
Cool.
Yeah. So that description, by the way, contains descriptions of God consciousness and clear description of Brahman consciousness, because she's talking about seeing the finest level of the relative, and everything looks luscious. There's a sort of a luminous
golden glasses, as Maharshi used to say.
Yeah. And people also will experience this in slightly different ways and to different degrees. And also it habituates. So, you don't just walk around and, say, oh my God, where's my sunglasses? Like that. But the world retains a character of magic about it.
Beautiful. Well, that might actually almost be a good point to wrap up on. You lose.
I have one more thing I'd like to give you here.
Sure.
I'm gonna get religious with you.
Okay.
Because I love this.
Praise the Lord.
Hallelujah. This is from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, if those who lead you say, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. And just to be clear, because he says the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you, in the same gospel, Jesus said to them, when you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, then you will enter the kingdom.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jerry. This has been great, and we're going to do it again one of these days because there's lots to talk about. But we'll, like P.T. Barnum said, leave them wanting more. So let me just wrap it up. I've been talking to my old friend Jerry Freeman. Jerry does not have a website about all this stuff, but he does have a Facebook page, and I'll be linking to that. And he's very active on Facebook, and writes and talks about a lot of this stuff on Facebook. So, anything else about yourself you want to say here that people won't find on your BatGap page?
I think I gave you links for the David Lynch Foundation.
Yeah, I'll be linking to that stuff.
Yeah, so as long as those are there, so people can look a little further if they're interested in TM or what the Lynch Foundation is doing. Mm-hmm. Wonderful programs with school children, hundreds of thousands of school children learning TM right now in South America across the United States. It's wonderful things happening. As long as those links are there, I think we're in good shape.
Good. All righty. And for those listening or watching, this is an ongoing interview series. So Jerry is, I think, number 199 or something. And so they're all archived on YouTube. But it's easier to kind of navigate them on batgap.com because I have indices there, both chronological and alphabetical, and you can explore all the interviews that have taken place. You can also subscribe either to the YouTube channel to have YouTube notify you when new ones are posted, but you can also subscribe on batgap.com to be notified by email each time a new one is posted. There's also a discussion group on BatGap, which is entitled Forum, and I'll be linking to Jerry's page in that discussion group from his page on BatGap. So I'm sure the discussion will get rolling and Jerry will participate. There's a donate button there, which I very much appreciate people clicking. And not only clicking, but actually donating if they can. And there's an audio podcast of this. So if you don't have the time to sit in front of your computer and watch interviews and see Jerry's beautiful face with his Connecticut background, you can at least listen to the audio while you're commuting or something. And so you'll see a link to that on every interview on BatGap. So good, that's it. Next week I'll be at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, and we'll probably be doing an interview or two out there, maybe with Francis Bennett, maybe Igor Kufeyev, maybe Ed Musica. We'll see what happens. So thanks for listening or watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Jerry.